Once upon a time, a little girl is celebrating Christmas with her father. They sit beside the tree, lights aglow, and she gives him a small book, one she wrote herself.
Open your present.
Contained within the pages are a series of stories, each one describing one of her dreams. But upon reading the scribbly words, the father will realize that these are no ordinary dreams for an 8-year-old child. Entry 1 states the following. Once upon a time, the evil animal, a snake-like monster with many horns, kills and devours all other animals. But God comes from the four corners, being in fact 4 separate gods, and gives rebirth to all the dead animals. Perplexed, the father keeps reading. Once upon a time, an ascent into heaven where pagan dances are being celebrated, and a descent into hell where angels are doing good deeds. Once upon a time, a horde of small animals frightens the dreamer. The animals increase to tremendous size, and one of them devours the little girl. The father reads a total of 12 dreams recorded by his daughter. He undoubtedly is confused, but plays them down to childlike whimsy. After all, they are just dreams. And time passes. The snow melts, the seasons change, and that Christmas gift sits inside a house as a memento and nothing more. Just a collection of stories. Not even a year later, the little girl would die from an infectious disease.
The world hangs on a thin thread.
We human beings are a complete anomaly when it comes to our relative amounts of REM sleep.
Basis from which dreams originate seem to be rather, let's call it with a vague expression, nature.
If that is so, we are setting off on a journey that you will never forget.
We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger, and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man.
We all dream every night, 4 or 5 times. Our dreams fascinate and intrigue us, but most of them are forgotten. And the few we do remember seem strange and confusing.
Dreaming is one of the most fascinating factors in human existence. We have been dreaming long before we could even speak about dreaming, and yet, after all these years, we still have no idea what to make of it. We can't directly observe them, we can't necessarily predict them, and thus, we struggle to scientifically research them. For the majority of my life, I thought very little of my dreams. Sure, sometimes I had a bad nightmare as a kid that I can remember to this day, but I never thought to consider its meaning. It was just a dream, nothing more. When I would sneak into my parents' bed after experiencing whatever terrifying images my dream displayed for me that night, they would tell me the same thing. It was just a dream. Go back to bed. Years passed, my brain changed, and with it my dreams did too. Less terrifying creatures, more of not being able to find my keys. I was safe from my mind. And then, in the last days of the spring semester of 2024, my careless safety net about dreams would disappear, all from a piece of music.
Thank you, Glenn. It's been an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to be here and to work with these fine players in making music. I wanted to offer the idea that musical tone is one of the most powerful forces in the world, maybe even the most powerful. We don't tend to think of it that way. But contemplate the idea of musical tone by itself. At the core of each tone is peace.
David Maslanka's piece, A Child's Garden of Dreams, was the most terrifying performance of music I have ever witnessed in my life. Composed in 1981, its purpose was to musically represent a little girl's dreams. Based upon the intro to this video and the sound of this music, you can tell this was no ordinary girl, nor were these ordinary dreams. As I was shoved back into my seat by a wall of sound before me, I clutched my program in hopes for answers. Found within the pages, a segment of Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols explains an interaction with a mourning father, a patient of his.
A very important case came to me from a man who was himself a psychiatrist. One day he brought me a handwritten booklet he had received as a Christmas present from his 10-year-old daughter. It contained a whole series of dreams she had had when she was 8. They made up the weirdest series of dreams I've ever seen, and I could well understand why her father was more than just puzzled by them. Though childlike, they were uncanny, and they contained images whose origin was wholly incomprehensible to the father. In the unabridged German original, each dream begins with the words of the old fairy tale, "Once upon a time." By these words, the little dreamer suggests that she feels as if each dream were a sort of fairy tale, which she wants to tell her father as a Christmas present.
Maslanka would go on to compose 5 movements for wind ensemble, each one encapsulating a different dream the little girl experienced documented by Carl Jung. Accompanying the piece was a brand new animated visual film published in 2024. What you have seen so far in this video have been short segments of those animations, only a fraction of the entire piece I witnessed that evening. This, combined with the music, provided an unforgettable experience, one that changed my life forever. I felt dissociative, like the music reached into my soul and pulled out the great mystery of why it was even functioning, a bridge between the conscious and unconscious mind. Not only could I read about the little girl in the program notes, but I could feel the terror she must have felt. Since hearing the piece live in concert, I haven't been able to recapture that feeling. Thus, I had to find out more. When I got home from the concert, my ears still humming from the dissonant chords, I found the book in which Jung documented his findings. But what it led to was me falling down a rabbit hole so deep that I still haven't found the bottom. The rest of this video is my story of what I discovered. I had a dream last night. I dreamt of silhouettes on a shoreline, their figures protruding out over a sea of blankness as tall mountains rolled in the distance. Each one wore a piece of clothing bearing a symbol, something I understood in the dream but don't understand now. Like that feeling when you remember someone's face but can't remember their name. The symbols were so strange. A road sign, an anglerfish, a strange geometric shape. They felt like something more, like they were supposed to represent something I knew but also didn't. Then I picked up my head, and I was sitting in front of my computer screen. I saw that same sign, but rather than a blanked sea, it occupied a black abyss. Something was on the horizon, just out of my grasp, covered in pixels and stillness. And now I remember 3 words. Have you ever heard of Fort Collins Productions? My journey started with finding out who exactly Carl Jung was. Being a psychology student, I had heard his name get brought up before and how he had close relations with Sigmund Freud, another definitely controversial king of the psychology field. A Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, Jung had an incredibly successful early career and worked with a multitude of incredible early psychology scholars. However, in his midlife, he found himself isolated, with Freud and other psychology scholars, once his close friends, rejecting his new beliefs on what would undoubtedly be his greatest contribution to the science: analytical psychology. In short, Jung was directing his entire career towards studying the unconscious mind, believing it held the key to some of humanity's oldest practices. In his isolation, at the age of 38, Jung would begin a series of experiments on himself, documenting them in 7 private journals, later named the Black Books. Many believe that the first notable entry in these books wouldn't come until well into the second book, on November 12, 1913. On that day, Jung described putting himself through a rigorous experiment in which he confronted the contents of his mind, kickstarting a transformation in which he would document his findings throughout the next 6 journals. It starts, my soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak, I call you. Are you there? I have returned, I am here again. I have shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I have come to you. I am with you. After long years of long wandering, I have come to you again. From this encounter onwards, Jung would never be the same.
Everybody went to church on
Yes.
Sunday.
And did you believe in God?
Oh, yes.
Do you now believe in God?
Now? Difficult to answer. I know. I don't need to believe. I know.
Fast forwarding, his work was often shielded out of sight of the public. Not only was his self-isolation a factor in this, but also his thoughts were so complex that many common readers could not understand them. Nobody was approaching the unconscious mind like he was, and he did it by diving so far into his own brain he barely ever published the findings. They instead remained locked away within the Black Books. Much of the information was consolidated within what scholars call the Red Book, often considered to be the greatest unpublished work in psychological history. It wasn't released to the popular public until decades after Jung's death. As you can see, much of Jung's life was locked within pages of notes. Ironically, this leads us to the book that inspired me to write this essay, one that Jung didn't want to write: Man and His Symbols. Brought up in Maslanka's program notes, I found an Internet Archive link to the book in its entirety and started to read. The introduction, written by John Freeman, discusses one of the most interesting interactions I have ever heard to convince someone to write a book. Freeman, hired by the British Broadcasting Corporation, was invited to interview Jung on the television program in 1959. It was somewhat successful and caught the attention of Wolfgang Voges, a modern psychology scholar of the time. Voges described how it was a shame that the common public had no direct access to Jung and his work with the unconscious mind. He decided to reach out and try to get Freeman to help him persuade Jung to write one last book, one targeting a general audience. Eager about the idea, Freeman agreed and they traveled to see Jung. It was a tall task to accomplish, trying to convince a man to release his life's work to the world after previously being shunned to lock it away in journals. After pitching the idea to him, he listened patiently and intently. Quote, he would weigh up a problem with care and without hurry, but when he did give his answer, it was usually final, Freeman states. Him and Voges were sternly turned down not soon after their pitch to Jung. Jung never believed in trying to popularize his work, and now at the end of his career was not excited about the idea of trying. He was not a man to likely change his mind either. Voges and Freeman would leave empty-handed, and Jung would return to his isolation and studies. But soon after, Jung would have a dream that would change the course of psychological history and impact my own life. It was a dream that allowed this essay to even exist, one in which would show the world the ancient and horrifying nature of our subconscious minds. he dreamt that he was giving a speech to a crowd of ordinary people, unusually giving him a keen amount of attention. Not only this, but they were understanding every word he said. This dream, one that Jung believed was an extension of his unconscious mind, was enough to convince him to work on the project. Now, Man and His Symbols is one of the most popular psychological works ever written. Jung would write the first section titled Approaching the Unconscious, and collaborating authors would write the rest. It would be the last work Jung ever wrote. He would die before seeing it published. After reading through Jung's chapter, I was desperately looking for the section in which the little girl is discussed. It was the reason I was here. I had to understand more of what was going on. Reading the intro, I was immediately hooked as to whatever next chapter was going to unfold in front of me. This wasn't supposed to exist, yet by almost divine intervention, it did. Jung wrote the first section, one in which the common world could finally understand what was going on inside his head. As pages passed, it was explained to me the function of dreams. It felt like I was sitting in a chair across from Jung where he was lecturing me on concepts that made no sense, and yet every sense imaginable. Archetypes, symbols, manifestations, stories, it all was so densely packed within the pages that I thought the book would collapse in on itself. One of his most important lessons was through every action we experience as people, there's an unconscious event that occurs simultaneously. These events are locked away from the conscious mind, but can be perceived through dreams. It is important to understand that what Jung defines as dreams isn't necessarily going to bed and having vivid images flash in front of your eyes. Free association is another term that Jung uses in relation with the act of dreaming, or in other words, daydreaming. When we get so lost in thought that we often see incredible things that are somewhat difficult to process. It's what happens when you stare at a painting for too long, look out a window for hours on end, or listen to a piece of music. I want you to hold on to this idea of free association. It is going to come up later. I continued to read, where Jung brought up countless stories of professors, friends, and patients interacting with their unconscious mind in all sorts of fashions. One in particular caught my attention, a professor who approached Jung believing he was insane for experiencing an unknown vision. With the patient in a complete panic, Jung simply grabbed a 400-year-old book from his shelf and showed it to him. Inside it contained the exact image the man had seen and described. Quote,
"There's no reason for you to believe you are insane," I said to him. "They knew about your vision 400 years ago."
And as that thought lingered around my head, I read the next paragraph, and I realized I had found what I was looking for. Now that you know who Carl Jung was, know a little about how he thought, and know that these were some of his final written words, let us go into depth about what I discovered.
We arrive one night to our amazement at a dream such as we never had before. It just shocks us because it is full of new images, new vision, and it's saying this was okay this far. Now we're moving in a whole new dimension. And the images from that point on radically shift.
Upon reading this dream for the first time, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. First of all, this dream wasn't even mentioned in Maslanka's Garden of Dreams. Just from the title alone, I already felt like I was in over my head. How was I supposed to make any sense of this? Which leads to my second thought. To think that an 8-year-old girl was having vivid dreams about these concepts is terrifying. especially because I still barely understand any of the symbolic references within these dreams. What she calls the evil animal sounds incredibly biblical and is further supported by the existence of God stated as a symbol and a character. Thus, my immediate thoughts were that this snake-like monster with horns was a representation of the devil. Moreover, God is described as being made up of 4 others and ends up saving the devoured creatures. It sounded like common motifs of the life cycle, but not being religious myself, I had no idea what to make of it. Luckily, Jung provides some answers. Jung brings up the word apokatastasis, a term used in Christianity to describe the salvation of everyone, including those who sin and even the devil himself. According to Jung, in the early beginnings of the church, it was believed that the Redeemer would perform a great reset on everything at the end of time, setting it back to the way it began. These are extensive Christian beliefs that, especially in the early 1900s, required an extensive knowledge of theology to understand their importance and direct symbolism. Yet, an 8-year-old girl was dreaming them and describing them. But what was most surprising to me, and to Jung as well, was that the little girl had barely any experience with religious education. Her parents' only knowledge of the Bible was through basic Christian beliefs, almost completely unrelated to the ancient philosophies the little girl experienced within these dreams. So, what was to be made of these symbols?
Dreams have been called the royal road to the unconscious. We'll be traveling down that royal road, but first we're going to look at a map. C.G. Jung discovered that in the apparent chaos of dreams, there are recurring figures and motifs which he documented and named. These landmarks are easily recognizable, and they act as reference points in dream interpretation. Once seen, then dreams begin to make some sense.
Why is it that we latch onto some stories more than others? How do you make a story that appeals to a large audience? Why do the great modern stories of Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Harry Potter, Dune, and others compare closely with the stories told from hundreds of years ago, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, 1001 Nights, and literally any Greek mythology story ever? If you ask these questions to Jung, he would be likely to give you a simple answer with an incredibly complex relationship with your mind. Archetypes. You've heard of them before. You know, the hero's journey. It's a pattern found in every great fantasy work ever. Stripping it to its roots, the hero goes on an adventure, they learn a lesson, and they return home transformed. Name an ultra-popular movie that doesn't do that to some degree, especially if it's fiction. According to Jung, this is just one of many archetypes found within our minds, being instinctual models of our unconscious mind. They've been there since we've been born, and they will be there until we die. It's why our stories are familiar across the world, why cultures with no contact with one another have the same common symbols and motifs in their stories. This gives us a clue as to how a little girl with no contact with ancient religion could have such fascinating dreams and recurring symbols with Christ. They're stories. If you throw away all the fancy terminology and incredibly confusing religious history, the girl's dreams boil down to a hero, a villain, and some sort of change. As Jung describes, the hero figure is an archetype, which has existed since time immemorial. But sure, this might explain the evil animal and, God, but how does it explain the rebirth of all animals? Maybe there are common archetypes for the hero and the villain, but the rebirth of animals from the hero? How can that be seen as anything other than a religious reference? Surely this must mean that something happened with this girl to introduce her to Christian beliefs that neither we nor her parents know. Jung does answer this question, but first we must ask another.
What is the compensatory meaning of these dreams, to which the little girl obviously attributed so much importance that she presented them to her father as a Christmas present?
In other words, why were these dreams even important to her in the first place?
Many people don't realize that dreams reveal the unconscious. That every element of a dream represents some aspect of their own personality. If, for example, a person dreams about wrestling with a dark stranger, what's difficult to understand is that the dark stranger represents some aspect of themselves that they're wrestling with. Let's look now at what Jung called the shadow.
Whether you have already gone through it or are going through it right now, what have you experienced in your adolescence? It is a period of time where our brains have now gotten close to their proper size and are trying to figure out what to do with all the space they've made for themselves. This is the time for us to learn new things, adapt to constantly changing environments, and unfortunately struggle, some of us more than others. We are resilient, but we are also malleable. It is oftentimes one of the most difficult processes to go through for many people. In the little girl's second dream, we can see that the common Christian values that outline the first dream have flip-flopped. Not only this, but in my own personal experience, the order of the dreams has been switched up. When I heard Maslanka's composition reenacting these dreams, the story was the final movement of the 5. Why would he choose it to be the last? Let's go back to the story itself. Here we have both an ascent into heaven to see pagan dances being celebrated, and a descent into hell where angels are doing good deeds. There isn't a clear hero, villain, or real story at all. It is just an observation and nothing more. Yet, it still was significant enough for the little girl to write it down in her book. Jung suggests it represents some sort of morality, which I agree with. And from what his reading has suggested so far, maybe this isn't meant to be taken so literally. Breaking it down, my personal thought is that it represents inclusivity, especially focusing on angels doing good deeds in hell. Perhaps we could infer that in this dream, the main symbol is not Christian beliefs, but accepting those for who they are. Now consider the age of the little girl during these dreams. She was 8, and likely at the beginning of seeing one of the most drastic periods of time in her life, adolescence.
The only earthly certainty is oblivion.
Welcome to the mysterious stranger. What? Hello.
Who are you?
An angel.
It was upon this realization that I now understand likely why Maslanka chose to put this piece last, because it serves as a key to interpret all of the others. Now, we know they aren't supposed to be taken quite so literally, and their meaning is much more complex and unique than previously thought. I would love for you to believe that I was the genius that came up with this interpretation of the little girl's dreams, but that unfortunately isn't the case. I must once again attribute this inference to Carl Jung. As he mentions, there are certain periods in our life when we are taught an exceptional importance on certain life lessons. Some of these lessons include morality, life, death, purpose, the origins of the world, and common values. Heavy topics in which we must be old enough to understand and begin our lives, or so old that we have forgotten and are approaching death. As Jung states, the little girl, as it happened, was in both these situations.
When I was younger, I used to sort of get dreams about when people were chasing me, and I'd be running along, and I couldn't run fast. I was as if I was being pulled back, and these people were getting nearer, and it was really frightening.
As the dreams are listed by Jung, each one further sets a standard that something is going wrong, being experienced, or being discovered. Dream 1 was a great reset experienced by the dreamer. Dream 2 was a silent observation of moral philosophies. Dream 3, then, is something going terribly wrong. This dream serves as movement 3 in Maslanka's piece and was by far the most memorable. The music shot through me and instilled this deep, evolutionary sense of fear. It also features multiple jump scare moments, further expressed through the giant animations looming above the concert hall. I'm not sure if there's a definite climax in this piece, but Movement 3 certainly contends for it. The music on its own is terrifying enough, add in the animation, and it made everything so much worse. But what sent a true shiver down my spine was knowing that this was real. This was a dream where the subconscious mind prepared the conscious for death. The interpretation starts as follows.
When I first read her dreams, indeed, I had the uncanny feeling that they suggested impending disaster. The reason I felt like this was the peculiar nature of the compensation that I deduced from the symbolism. It was the opposite of what one would expect to find in the consciousness of a girl that age.
What Jung suggests, and as you have possibly concluded while watching this video, is that the unconscious mind can show signs of death to the conscious in evolutionary ways so grounded in said evolution, we often can't assimilate why. To think that every dream we dream, whether it be late at night or lost in thought looking through a window, our brain could be warning us about something in the future. It's just awful. While I was reading this passage in particular, I legitimately had to take a break for a second to keep myself from spiraling out of control. What if my brain was giving me warning signals of something bad happening and I just have no idea how to analyze them? Taking a step out of this story for a second, I know it sounds crazy, and it really is. The only comfort I have found so far upon reading this is that it may not be true. None of it can be explicitly proven. But what is even more scary is that the entire field of psychology hasn't even been around that long. Wilhelm Wundt is often deemed the founder of experimental psychology, and he was around in the late 1800s. Actual early psychoanalysis didn't even happen much until Freud did it a lot in the early 20th century. 100 and so years might seem like a lot, but that really is nothing compared to other scientific fields. Aerospace engineering has literally been around since the 1700s. So, who's really to say that Jung is wrong? He certainly had issues that I will describe later, but this is a realm of psychology none of us have really known how to handle. I'm going to school for psychology right now, and I can't find a single person who feels confident talking about dreams. Besides the point, let's look back into this dream for a moment. The animal that devours the little girl is likely supposed to represent death, or the act of dying. The way it is described as a force, a pack of animals overwhelmingly surrounding the girl, shows that whatever it is her unconscious mind was facing, it felt outmatched. I could not find any information on what disease this little girl passed away from other than that it was infectious, as Jung informs. I don't think we will ever know more than that. Let's move forward.
Typical nightmare is that one is pursued by some terrible or demonic or unknown power, and one runs and runs for one's life, and knowing all the time in the dream that finally they will get one. And you hide, and you can't hide, and they will see you, and you look for another hiding place, and they will discover you again, and you run and run. Persecution always means something wants to come to us. The only way to meet a persecuting demon is to turn around and to say, "Here I am, what do you want from me?"
It is from this point onwards that the dreams aren't explicitly analyzed by Jung within the text. Because of this, I am going to offer my own symbolistic analysis of each one to try and make some sense of them. It is important that I state that all of these dreams are obviously up to interpretation, and no interpretation can be seen as correct. It is theorizing and nothing more. If you have your own theories, please share them in the comments and start a conversation. In the fourth dream, the common motif follows another silent observation by the little girl. I believe there are two important factors to consider here, one being the big picture and the other being a small picture that contributes to the meaning. The big picture is that I believe this dream represents the little girl's personality, being formed in early adolescence. The unconscious mind is likely to express this within archetypes that don't make a ton of sense on the surface level, which leads us to the smaller picture. The mouse likely represents the girl's consciousness in some sort, being shaped into the proper person. I believe that each of the creatures affecting the mouse thus are different personalities. It follows closely with the nurture side of the nature versus nurture debate, which, if you don't know what that is, it basically is this decades-long debate on whether or not our biological composition or upbringing influences our traits more. It's both, by the way. Anyways, each creature represents a personality trait the little girl likely experienced amongst her friends and family. The worm, often seen as a symbol for renewal and the cyclical nature of life, could either represent a teacher or the idea of life being taught to the little girl. The snakes are a popular archetype that often are associated with villains or evil traits. The fishes represent a lot of stuff. It was difficult to find one popular meaning, with answers ranging from rebirth to representing the unconscious higher self. My best guess is that it further emphasizes the symbolism of the worms. Finally, human beings are the last creatures mentioned. To me, these aren't to be taken as literal human beings, but rather who the girl wants to become. In other words, it is the piece of herself that she will always carry with her from birth. There's a part of the story I left out. This portrays the 4 stages of humankind. The reason I did this is because I don't think it serves symbolistic importance, as I'm not quite sure if the little girl actually wrote this. It sounds a lot like Jung interpreting the dream after the fact, but he has it listed down in the title. You will come to see that all of these dreams have moments like that. This dream found its way into Maslanka's piece, being the longest movement at just over 9 minutes. What really made this movement impactful to me was the animation. I unfortunately can't show you much of it, but throughout the whole runtime, the animation zoomed in on a single drop of water. As it continued to zoom in, different colors, stencil images, and pastels flashed on screen, and I felt like I was taken on a journey within a journey. A side quest, in a way. The animation does this a lot, taking the dreams more literal than metaphorical. Many of the illustrations shown in the film were actually done by Maslanka himself. To be honest, it was incredibly difficult finding any information regarding these pastel drawings that are credited on the cover of the film. However, I did find one image of them pinned to a bulletin board. Take a look for yourself. I am not sure if these actually were supposed to represent visions Maslanka saw while composing the piece, but let me instead leave you with the quote found on the related post. Quote, "When David would come to a rough spot in the compositional process, he drew pastels with his left hand. This practice helped David engage his subconscious mind, which aided him in composing." This dream is quite grand in nature, taking the little girl out of her reality and forcing to see it through a microscope lens. Across many different cultures, water is seen as the archetype for creation, the starting point of all things living. Consequently, the branches seen within the water are likely archetypal extensions of the tree of life, another archetype to represent the interconnectedness of all things living, both good and bad. By the dream of making the little girl look at this complex relationship through a microscope, my theory is that this is the little girl coming into contact with her own creation and humanity. Perhaps in this dream, the little girl dove so far into the subconscious that she was seeing her biological and sociological identities. I believe that this dream is supposed to offer a mirror to the little girl to show her that what she is experiencing, both physically and mentally, is as old as time itself.
Take dream like being like a tree or a wild pig or something. We cannot say what makes a wild pig. Well, if we believe in God, then we'll say God makes the wild pigs. But about that, it is that unknown power or mysterious force which makes all existence. The best perhaps is to call it, with a vague expression, the Godhead or nature, which in such a vague sense that we don't pin it down to anything special, because we just don't know. The only thing by observing dreams for a long time is that we see it has a superior intelligence in it. Perhaps you have seen that in some of the dreams.
You may have noticed that the tone of these dreams is beginning to change, where humans are beginning to become more involved than animals, and each story has darkness within it. From this, I believe Dream 6 is stating more of the same that we have heard so far, further illustrating the personality characteristics that are trying to affect the little girl. This dream seems much more like something she would have seen in school, possibly an example given by a teacher of something bad kids do. But what makes the dream less simple is that the passers-by, innocent people in the context of the story, are turned into something evil. Rather than showing usual childlike empathy and understanding, instead the little girl is indirectly expressing fear and irritation to those who come into contact with the bad boy throwing things, as they too now are bad. This establishes a new motif that has not been seen yet. Anger. Maslanka chose for this story to also be involved in his piece, basing the second movement off of it. It is the last of the dreams that has any sort of hope within it, but it is incredibly peculiar. For some reason, I find it more shocking that the little girl is dreaming about a drunken woman becoming sober rather than thoughts of death or creation. The reason for this is because the symbols of ancient evil, death, and heroes are pretty common. As a kid, I too was afraid of death and wondered how we came to even exist in the first place. But a woman falling into water and coming out renewed and sober peculiarly sticks out amongst the other dreams. My best interpretation is that this isn't exactly a dream that holds as much significance as the others, possibly being a story a friend told her that was tarnished by the biblical and existential thoughts her unconscious mind was providing to her. It is, in my opinion, the most peaceful movement of Maslanka's work, lulling you into a sense of ease before terrifying you with movement 3. This is the only dream where we are given an actual location, America. At face value, this dream seems to be a critique of American society, specifically the anthill symbolically representing capitalism. In order for an ant colony to function, its labor must be divided among its inhabitants, who then receive specializations. It is a busy, chaotic, and individualistic society in which every individual contribution serves a goal to further better said society. But within the system, theoretically, every ant is working together towards a common goal. It also is difficult to symbolize the ants as people in this dream when people are present, rolling on top of the hill and being attacked by its hosts. On the one hand, it could be hypothesized that the little girl was dreaming about critiques of capitalism, how the very system is attacking its own contributors, possibly something she learned in class at 8 years old. It seems like a bit of a stretch to say that was the case. Furthermore, how does that have anything to do with the dreamer falling into a river? Instead of this approach, I would like to offer a different theory. It is difficult to get a specific date as to which Jung first had his encounter with the little girl's father. However, Jung's practice primarily took place during the early 20th century at a hospital in Switzerland. At this point in time, it is safe to assume that the little girl and her father likely experienced news, propaganda, and emotional distress associated with the wars going on during that time period. Jung states in his book that the stories were written in German, thus it isn't a stretch to assume that the two likely lived in Germany or were heavily influenced by German culture. So, let us look again at this dream strictly with the face value approach. There is a setting in America, a violent encounter going on between ants and people, and it frightens the little girl who falls into a river. My theory is that this conflict experienced in her dreams was an archetype in which the subconscious mind was trying to process emotions of war and the evolutionary need to flee from that said situation. But what is more important to this dream than understanding the specifics of its metaphorical relationships is its one common motif: a fear of suffering and death. What's more is that assuming these dreams are expressed in a linear fashion, this means that the motifs of suffering and death are starting to become more prevalent as time passes. This is the final dream listed that Maslanka decided to include in his piece. Ironically, he chose to make this dream the first movement. From a musical perspective, it has a grand entrance in which the audience is introduced to the beginnings of a musical journey. It is declamatory, off-putting, and then it just tears itself apart. Maslanka does an exceptional job in this movement, showing the audience exactly how to feel about all of these dreams, and simultaneously expresses the little girl's feelings as well. They are grand in scope, with glimmers of good and light, but they are tarnished by evil, wrongdoing, and death. The childlike whimsy of these dream motifs are shattered to show the darkness seeping through. Through an archetypal lens, the desert in the dream can represent mysticism, illusion, and hopelessness. When the girl begins to sink in this mysticism, she comes to find the darkness in which she is most afraid of. It's almost as if she came face to face with the darkness trapped inside her unconscious mind, feeding off of her. At this point, there is no more guide. There is no music we can possibly use as another input, no specific analysis from Jung on this dream. It is just you, the audience, and me, the reader. One thing is for certain, that within the timeline, we are reaching the end. We've reached dream 10 out of 12, nearing closer to death with every dream that passes. I felt I was at a complete loss when trying to analyze this dream. What on earth could it possibly mean? She's obviously coming into contact with something, possibly the same darkness expressed in the previous dream, but before she can really perceive what it is she's interacting with, a man comes and kills her. The door was slammed shut, the dream ended. It's as if she was discovering things through her subconscious mind that she wasn't supposed to be discovering. And then I reread one of Jung's final paragraphs on the subject.
It was as if future events were casting their shadow back by arousing in the child certain thought forms that, though normally dormant, describe or accompany the approach of a fatal issue. Although the specific shape in which they express themselves is more or less personal, their general pattern is collective. They are found everywhere and at all times, just as animal instincts vary a good deal in the different species and yet serve the same general purposes. They function when the occasion arises, in more or less the same way in all of us.
It was after reading this that I had a new hypothesis. What if the girl had come into contact with the soul? Nobody can give you a scientific definition of what the soul actually is, only that it is the essence of life. There is no way to locate it, no way to measure it, but we still believe that it exists. There has to be more than chemistry and neurons at play as to why we are the way we are. There are still things our brains aren't capable of understanding. What if dreams led this little girl to the precipice of finding out this answer? It is difficult to describe these ventures with the subconscious mind as dreams now. They have now turned themselves into nightmares. The body was now deliberately warning the girl of an impending disaster, which would turn out to be more literal than ever anticipated. It's almost as if the subconscious mind determined that archetypal symbols weren't enough, combining them with the literal disease which was now inside of the little girl. It is impossible to pinpoint when exactly the little girl was infected by the disease that killed her, as we don't know exactly what it was. But for the first time, the word disease is mentioned, and serves as a character in the dream. This literal character is then juxtaposed by the archetype, the birds. Birds represent many different elements, including harbingers of death, signs of the afterlife, and hope. From what I could find, the general consensus is that birds are not thought to be evil, but instead a form of justice, hoping to ease the fear of those who are dying and show them that there is something more as they can see all. With the birds coming out of the little girl's skin, it serves as a symbol towards protection and transportation, both allowing the girl to pass while directing her towards the next something. That something is perhaps the greatest mystery of all.
Jung had a vision at the end of his life of a catastrophe. It was a world catastrophe.
I don't want to speak much about it. One of his daughters took notes and after his death gave it. And there's a drawing with a line going down, up and down, and underneath is the last 50 years of humanity. And some remarks about the final catastrophe being ahead. But I have only those notes.
Mm-hmm.
The final dream, and thus the end of the story, it is fitting that it ends in one of the most hauntingly beautiful ways imaginable. Gnats obscuring the sun and moon most closely resembles the biblical event mentioned in the Exodus, specifically the plague of gnats in which all humans and animals suffered. It can be interpreted in many different ways, but generally gnats are associated with suffering before death, warning, and the doing of God. It illustrated a chaotic scene in which the little girl's world is collapsing in on itself, where what made little sense is now making no sense at all. But the last hope is the star falling upon her. At the very end of all of this, after so much death, despair, and fear, we are given one sign that the little girl might be okay. The star from the heavens, the archetype of hope and awakening, has fallen from its perch to help. I'm not sure why I feel that the little girl is okay, but I do. Maybe it's naive optimism, but I'd like to hope that a girl who expressed nothing more but the innocence of adolescence was spared from the horrors that lie after the final curtain is closed. I don't know if the star falling made a sound in the dream, or if it initially scared the little girl, but I hope that it showed her things so beautiful that no mind could ever comprehend them. I hope that when she laid in her bed for the last time before she crossed into the unknown, that star visited her again in her dreams. One last sign that things were going to be okay before her world was gone.
Based on your experience of dreams, do you believe in life after death?
I wouldn't say I believe in it. That is a bit too strong. I would say it seems to me from the dreams that there is a life after death. And because I think that dreams do not cheat and are not wish fulfillment, there must be something going on. There must be an aspect of life or the psyche going on.
After going through each dream one by one, I am still left with more questions than answers. The concepts that Jung describes in these passages are all over the place, where no clear definition is given for what caused these dreams and no answers are thoroughly provided. It is likely that for the rest of this story's existence, everything will be speculation and nothing more. We don't know her name, her family's name, nor the specific time frame in which her father visited Jung. Thus, we have to trust Jung thoroughly that the story he has illustrated while working with the little girl's father is true. To this day, it is incredibly difficult to find scientific evidence that Jung's statements are true, primarily because they are almost impossible to test to begin with. Not only this, but Jung is one of the most highly debated figures in the world of psychology. He wasn't a great person, being deemed by the New York Times as an insufferable egotist, cruel to his family, a womanizer with bad table manners to boot. He even had ties with the Nazi Party during its rise to power due to their funding for research and psychoanalysis. He wasn't a fantastic person by any stretch, but little is fully understood on what Jung actually believed in. Through the research I have done, it seems more common for the academic community to shun Jung because his claims can't be scientifically proven, more so than him demonstrating anti-Semitic sentiments. Take with that what you will. But diving further into what Jung even focused on to begin with, dreams themselves go against almost every norm in the psychological world, making little sense and giving researchers very little to work with when trying to analyze their data. We know the brain is active when sleeping, especially during REM sleep when memory is being consolidated, but every explanation can be refuted quite easily as of now. I've almost completed my undergraduate degree in psychology, and I have yet to have a professor give me a solid answer on why dreams happen, let alone what they mean. As science continues to exponentially grow, we might finally find some answers in the coming years about what all of this means. A true answer to if the body can actually prepare itself for death months before the final day occurs. But until that day, we can only sit here and theorize.
But contemplate the idea of musical tone by itself. At the core of each tone is peace. And that is a cumulative function of a piece of music. It creates peace. When people are performing together, they're at peace with themselves and with one another. They're at peace with the community. The community comes and participates in peace. This is the core of what's going to carry us through the current extremely difficult times.
So, after all of this, after analyzing Jung's dreams to the best of my ability, reading about terrifying encounters with the subconscious mind, and fearing my own dreams, I found myself drawn back to David Maslanka. the composer that started this entire journey for me. One of my primary questions that still hasn't been answered while researching his piece of music was why he chose these dreams in particular. Furthermore, why did he put them out of order? While I was trying to find answers to these questions, I was directed towards an incredible dissertation by Dr. David Booth. This 235-page document contains within it musical analysis of each movement, the piece's effects on the classical band world, and even segments of interviews with Maslanka himself. If I were to break down the music theory and leitmotif analysis of this piece, it would take another massive video. Maslanka composed numerous musical motifs about the little girl, which are then dotted around the composition. Just like the archetypes in movies such as the hero, the ring, or the lover, Maslanka in turn used his own archetypes in his piece with musical motifs associated. Maslanka himself was a spiritual person, and what stood out to me more than anything else in this dissertation was how Maslanka composed the piece. He took direct inspiration from the story itself, where subconscious meaning and dialogue overpowered the structure of the conscious mind. From this, he composed the entire piece through spontaneous means, focusing less on the overall structure and more on what his unconscious mind was telling him in the moment. Quote, "I wanted the work to be able to stand on its own, from a purely musical standpoint, free from the necessity for the listener to be cognizant of the referential side of the music. However, the unfolding of the music itself parallels the transformation experience of the dreams. Thus, an understanding of the referential aspects of the piece, coupled with experiencing a pure musical substance of the work, has the possibility to transport the listener to deeper connections." After reading this passage, it was clear to me now why I felt free association while listening to this piece of music for the first time. It was designed from the very beginning as an encounter with the unconscious, where the music crosses into a fourth dimension in which it molds itself to the listener. This was the reason why I had never been more terrified listening to another piece of music, because this piece was made to reach into a part of me I didn't even know was there.
Is it possible to actually diagnose a disease from a dream?
After the event, one can say so, but I wouldn't have dared to say so ahead of time. I would have only said you are living against your own instincts, and that will very likely end up in some kind of disease. Because it's obvious if you eat too much or too little, or if you sleep too much or too little, if you do anything against your instinct, you are likely to catch a disease.
I now find myself more scared than I was before doing all of this. Just a couple months ago, dreams were just dreams and nothing more. They were rare, and I hardly ever remembered them. But now, it's hard for me to lay down in bed and not think about my subconscious mind giving me warning of impending disaster every time I close my eyes. Since tumbling down this rabbit hole, I found myself not only having more vivid dreams, but also remembering them much more clearly. Instead of waking up with hardly any memory of what happened, I now wake up being able to detail every moment clearly. Originally, I was considering discussing Jung and then documenting my own subpar Jungian analysis on myself and my dreams. But after reading all of this and thinking about it every night, I have since steered away from that thought entirely. There are still things we don't understand about the object that makes our understanding possible in the first place. I would much rather bury my head in the sand in ignorance than mess with things I don't understand. Jung might have been wrong, but there must have been things he saw in all those years of isolation that none of us could ever comprehend into words. Unfortunately, all of us have the chance of seeing those demons every night we close our eyes. So while you are getting ready for bed, and your phone screen is the only light in your room as you pull the covers up, I want you to think about 4 words. 4 words that have changed the course of history, changed the boundaries of our dreams, changed our lives, shown us the thoughts of a little girl terrified of her own mind, and shown us one of humanity's last great mysteries. Once upon a time. Thank you so much for watching. This was a long video, my biggest project yet, and I have been researching this for months on end. If you would like to support the channel directly, you can check out my Ko-fi page, be on the lookout for some merch that's coming out soon, and go join my Discord server to become part of the conversation. I appreciate your support, thank you so much, and I can't wait to show you guys what I'm working on next. Thanks, and sweet dreams tonight.